Last week in service, we talked about resolutions and white supremacy. And we talked about how there's no such thing as a blank slate, how we all come from our ancestors, and whatever privileges or oppressions they experienced are a part of our story too. Today, Reverend Aisha and I will delve a little deeper into what that means for our church. In fact, we have several legacies we are grappling with here at First Parish in Malden. There's the legacy of what this church has done, or hasn't done, as a church, the direct impacts of the actions of the people who came before us. And then there's the legacy of our spiritual ancestors, those who were Unitarians or Universalists, or Unitarian Universalists, the faith we belong to. Though these are the people who influenced this church, our theology and our values, and made it possible for us to be the Unitarian Universalist congregation we are today. Both of these legacies are a part of our DNA, and we are responsible for them, even if they happened before we were Unitarian Universalists, or before we joined this congregation, or before we were born. So let's start at the beginning. In colonial Malden, there were quite a few people recorded as enslaved on tax records by various people who have connections to our congregation. Records are incomplete, but there's a tax document specifically from the year 1771, only a few decades before slavery was abolished here in Massachusetts, and it shows 10 enslaved people living in Malden. And a few of the names of the enslavers stuck out to me as folks who were related to our church: Sprague, Green, Dexter, Hill, all of whom had associations with our congregation. And this was only the recorded enslaved people. Many people at the time chose not to report those they kept enslaved so they wouldn't have to pay taxes on them. So we can assume the number is actually higher. Now, one of the names that really sticks out to me is Sprague. The third meeting house of this congregation was built on land that was donated by the Sprague family in 1729. So likely a slaveholding family at that time. This is our fifth meeting house, right? There's been 5 meeting houses of the church. But here, in this building that was built in 1907, we have the Sprague family name on the wall of this window right here. And we also have it in our social hall. Now, the people it commemorates, right, were not slaveholding themselves. This meeting house was built after slavery had been abolished. But the money that they had, in some part, it was money that was achieved through having had ancestors who were slave holding. Even if it was only 1 or 2 domestic enslaved workers, the benefits are undeniable. And they likely came from many of the main families that supported this congregation. And if that money comes through the congregation and in some way has allowed us to be who we are today, what does that say of our responsibility in the present? That certainly some of the money for this very congregation we stand in came directly from those who held other people as property. Our ancestors are complicated.
Our spiritual ancestors beyond First Parish have always been complicated too. They have held strong beliefs that they sometimes then acted against. In the story Theodore Parker and the Crafts by Polly Peterson, I learned that President Millard Fillmore was a Unitarian who publicly talked about hating slavery, who also signed the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which required not only the return of escaped enslaved people to their owners, but also required citizens in the North to capture them, to send them back. God knows I detest slavery, Fillmore wrote to Daniel Webster, his Secretary of State, but we must endure it and give it such protection as is guaranteed by the Constitution till we can get rid of it without destroying the last hope of free government in the world. Basically, yeah, slavery is bad, but the Constitution protects it, and we don't want our country to end, so what are you going to do? And Fillmore's Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, was also a Unitarian who personally opposed slavery, who paid with his own money for the freedom of several enslaved people, and who also helped draft the Compromise of 1850 to keep the Union together, which included the Fugitive Slave Law. Even Theodore Parker himself, one of our amazing ancestors in faith, who fought hard for abolition, who defended escaped enslaved people and helped them get to freedom. That's what that story I read was about. Even Theodore Parker believed that white people were the superior race. Our ancestors were complicated.
The challenges here at First Parish were not only about slavery, but continued into civil rights. In the 1960s, while the fight for civil rights was raging, while Boston schools were still segregated, what was our participation in this idea of racial justice, in the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that we celebrate this weekend? Well, I went back through some old orders of service that often included excerpts from sermons and parish news to see what it was that we were doing in regards to racial justice and civil rights in the 1960s. I decided to look at a few inflection points where we might have had something to say. Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, which called out specifically leaders in the white church. Dr. King's March on Washington, the March for Voting Rights in Selma, Alabama, where another white UU minister, Reverend James Reed from Boston, was killed, and Dr. King's death. All events I imagine our congregation, and especially its ministers, knew about. And I was honestly a little surprised to find that there was no mention of Dr. King, no mention of racial struggle and civil rights that was brewing throughout the country until the Sunday after Dr. King's death. Surely they knew about these other things, right? But silence on something can be complicity. We were not a strong voice for racial equality at this time. The Sunday after MLK's death, April 7th, 1968, I finally found some reference to him and the struggles for racial justice. The minister at the time, Reverend Dr. Richardson Reed, quoted Dr. King as stating, "If a man hasn't found something worth dying for, he isn't worth living." Reverend Dr. Reed goes on to say, "These are the words spoken by Martin Luther King only a short time before his death. A man who challenged the world with his ideas, clearly spoken without malice and without fear of the conflict they would bring upon him. I did not always agree with the tactics of this great American, which was my mistake, perhaps. However, never could I deny his moral courage and lofty goals. I have little doubt he died as he wished to die, a martyr in the cause dictated by his values, which called to all men to recognize the differences and conflict, however, need never destroy in violence, but rather can be the basis for growth through understanding. Dr. King's death is the curse of our innocence of any involvement in his cause of nonviolent action. He died, as did Jesus, because good people had failed to act soon enough." A bit of reckoning, I suppose. A move in the right direction, ever so slowly. The next week, there's a notice in the order of service, and it's titled, "Do You Really Care?" which I think is hilarious. And it's in requesting funds to support the cause of Martin Luther King to work for the rights of all men, regardless of race. It does seem like a movement in the right direction, but then it just stops. The next time he talks about race isn't for months later. He speaks disparagingly about Nat Turner's rebellion, a violent rebellion of an enslaved man in Virginia in 1863. But again, never discusses the issue of race that were relevant at the time. He spends time disparaging the anti-Vietnam activists that were draft dodgers in Arlington Street Church in Boston, a Unitarian Universalist congregation. But he never speaks about race. And so our little tiny moment of almost activism died as soon as it had been born. Of course, let us not forget the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Our ancestors were complicated.
In our reading earlier by Reverend Dr. Rebecca Savage, we heard about the Thomas Jefferson Ball at the 1993 UU General Assembly. This is a story I have heard so many times that every time hits me right in the heart. At the 2018 General Assembly, Reverend Dr. Hope Johnson and 3 other folks who had been involved in decision-making at the time shared their reactions on what had happened and invited UUs to think about how events and processes in their congregations might similarly not take into account how they will be received by all members of the community. And you probably don't need me to say this, but 1993 was not the last time that something racist happened at General Assembly. In 2005, at the Fort Worth GA, youth of color were repeatedly mistaken for hotel staff by white GA attendees, asked to park their cars and carry their luggage. In one of the GAs since I became a UU, I can't remember which one, youth of color were followed around the exhibit hall and accused of stealing from the exhibitors. Another year, security barred young folks of color from entering the convention center, assuming they couldn't be there for the conference. And these are just the stories that I have heard and then remembered. In 2018, Reverend Dr. Hope Johnson said that the Thomas Jefferson Ball was an important moment in our history, in part because those involved were willing to stay in relationship, to have conversation and understand what others were truly saying, and then not move on and pretend it never happened. That's part of what we're trying to do here today. Not sweep things under the rug, but acknowledge the truth of our history. Our ancestors were complicated. This is our legacy. Unitarian Universalists like to think of ourselves as the ones who have always been on the right side of history. But the truth is, it is much more complicated than that. And it's so important to know the realities of our history, to share and learn and tell it. And we know that our present is not perfect either. There are so many stories, too many stories, of people who have been deeply hurt in our congregations and in our denomination. It breaks my heart. I've heard people say before that if we share these things from our history and from our present, we will scare people away from our faith. But on the contrary, I think if we are able to tell the truth, to name when we have gone wrong, to apologize sincerely and take accountability and work to do better, we will find ourselves growing, not shrinking. And as I reflect on the past of our faith and the present, I find myself thinking ahead to the future. What will our spiritual descendants need to reconcile about who we are now? We could pretend that there isn't anything, but we know better. We know that we do not always live up to the values of our faith, that we are not always the people and communities that we want to be. And beloveds, my fervent hope, my dream is that we will start reckoning with those things now, so that those who come after us don't need to be digging through old orders of service and archival material to unearth and discover them. Can we be aware of and grapple with the ways that we are falling short now and work to change them? Can we be the people who learn and share our history as it truly has been, who recognize the realities of our present so that we can build a future we are proud of? I hope we can. I'll keep trying. Will you join me?